Welcome everyone to another Explainer. I am so thrilled you're here today because we're looking at a truly fascinating, deeply layered topic. When most people think of the Dominican Republic, their minds immediately jump to pristine beaches and crystal clear waters. But today, we're going to explore the complex, sometimes turbulent, and incredibly vibrant historical tapestry that actually built this nation. We're going way beyond the postcards.
Okay, let's dive into this. To understand the scale of the modern perception versus the historical reality, just look at this number, 3 million. Every single year, over 3 million tourists flock to the all-inclusive resorts. It's an absolute economic powerhouse, yet relatively few of those visitors actually know the profound, often bloody, and resilient history of the very ground they're walking on. It's a story of indigenous roots, brutal colonization, divided lands, and an enduring quest for identity.
Section 1. Roots, Ruins, and Colonization.
Here's a compelling question to frame our understanding right off the bat. Did the Taíno people really disappear? For centuries, it's been this uncritically accepted myth that the indigenous Taíno people were driven to total, absolute extinction following European contact. But as we look closely at the source material, a much more nuanced reality emerges.
Well, it is an undeniable historical fact that European diseases, forced labor, and violence decimated the Taíno population. Their legacy absolutely survived. Just look at the everyday words we use. Words like iguana, barracuda, maize, guanabana, and tiburon, which is literally the Spanish word for shark. Who knew you were speaking Taíno at the beach, right? And beyond linguistics, their local agricultural practices and their deep understanding of the land were just completely absorbed into the culture. So they didn't simply vanish, their heritage became a foundational thread in the Dominican identity.
Now, that early contact rapidly turned into a brutal crucible of Spanish colonization. In 1492, Columbus lands on the island the Taíno called Quisqueya, later known as Hispaniola. They quickly established La Navidad, their first fort, and eventually Santo Domingo, which actually became the very first European capital in the Americas. But this rapid expansion had a massive dark cost. As the Taíno civilization collapsed under the weight of exploitation, the Spanish needed a new workforce for their incredibly lucrative sugar plantations. And this directly led to the mass importation and enslavement of Africans, fundamentally altering the island's demographic and cultural future forever.
Section 2. A fractured island.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the island physically and culturally split. By the late 1600s, the French had taken firm control of the western third. The French colony of Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti, was built on intense, brutal slave labor, producing immense global wealth through coffee, cotton, and sugar. Meanwhile, the Spanish-controlled East, which would become the Dominican Republic, was largely neglected by the Spanish crown. With less focus on massive exports, it developed an economy based on subsistence agriculture and cattle ranching. Literally two completely different colonial trajectories playing out on one single piece of land.
Because of these differing trajectories, the 19th century was just a dizzying era of chaos and conflict for the East. In 1822, Haitian President Jean-Pierre Boyer occupied the Eastern Territory. Now, while this occupation actually abolished slavery, it fueled deep resentment among the Dominican elites. This led to secret mobilizations, and in 1844, Juan Pablo Duarte and his secret society, La Trinitaria, finally declared Dominican independence. But the fight for sovereignty wasn't over. Get this, in 1861, fearing instability, General Pedro Santana actually annexed the territory back to Spain. It took the bloody Restoration War, which the Dominicans finally won in 1865, to secure lasting independence.
Section 3. Dictators and Civil War. The central figure of this turbulent period was Generalissimo Rafael Trujillo, whose iron-fisted rule spanned from 1930 all the way to 1961. The historical sources outline a really intense authoritarian regime that permeated every single aspect of Dominican life. Trujillo established a brutal secret police force to violently suppress political opposition, eradicate union leaders, and silence activists. He also strategically allied his regime with the Catholic Church to project a sense of legitimacy to the outside world.
One of the most horrific events of Trujillo's regime happened in 1937, known as the Parsley Massacre. The historical record estimates that between 20,000 and 30,000 Haitians and Dominicans of Haitian descent were systematically slaughtered. According to the accounts, victims were often identified and targeted simply based on their inability to correctly pronounce the Spanish word for parsley. It's a truly tragic and brutal enforcement of arbitrary borders and racial division.
Trujillo's assassination in 1961 left a massive power vacuum, initiating a rapid descent into chaos. In 1962, a reformist named Juan Bosch was elected president. only to be ousted by a military coup just a year later. By 1965, revolutionary factions known as constitutionalists demanded Bosch's return, and that sparked a civil war right in the streets of Santo Domingo. The violence escalated dramatically. On April 22nd, U.S.-backed police forces killed over 350 protesting students. And by May, viewing the conflict entirely through the lens of the Cold War, United States troops had actually occupied the country, fundamentally altering the course of the Republic's history once again.
Section 4. Rhythms, Sugar, and Resorts.
Shifting gears to their agricultural foundation, sugar remains the absolute dominant force. Accounting for a massive 66% of their primary agricultural exports, sugar cultivation is deeply, deeply tied to both the nation's historical roots of colonization and its modern economic stability.
But of course, agriculture alone didn't build the modern economy. A major transformation occurred with policies like Ley 890, which granted massive tax breaks to create booming free trade zones, relying primarily on cheap labor for garment manufacturing. Alongside this, the government heavily incentivized luxury tourism. Those isolated all-inclusive beach resorts in Punta Cana that we mentioned at the start, they completely transformed the financial landscape, driven heavily by a long, continuing history of foreign, particularly U.S. investment in hospitality and infrastructure.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it captures the soul of the country. Merengue and bachata are not just musical genres. They are literally the Dominican identity translated into sound. They blend African, Spanish, and indigenous rhythms together, merengue with its driving tambora drum, and bachata with its heartfelt tales of rural marginality and heartbreak. Both started as marginalized, working-class expressions. Today, they've blasted off to international fame, even earning recognition as UNESCO cultural heritage. It's a beautiful evolution from the margins to the center stage of the world.
Section 5. The Modern Identity Complex. Bringing us to the present day, the source texts point to a deeply embedded concept known as anti-Haitianismo. This is defined by researchers as a historical and political ideology pushed heavily by Dominican elites over generations. The core of this ideology promoted a narrative of a Spanish white national identity, deliberately marginalizing and erasing the nation's African heritage. As the research notes, this ideology was basically utilized to create a stark, rigid divide with neighboring Haiti, fostering a legacy of resentment that shapes politics to this very day.
And the modern consequences of this history are highly visible and deeply impactful. In a sobering development in 2013, the Dominican Constitutional Court actually ruled to retroactively reassess citizenship requirements. As a direct result of this legal change, an estimated 300,000 Dominicans of Haitian descent, many of whose families had lived in the country for generations, were rendered stateless virtually overnight.
So what we see today are the undeniable, ongoing, modern echoes of centuries of history. The legacy of a divided island continues to manifest right now. The source texts outline a reality where deep wealth disparity, arbitrary mass expulsions, and an ongoing humanitarian crisis regarding citizenship and human rights remain unresolved. The historical ghosts of colonialism and dictatorship continue to enforce very real, tangible borders for the people living there today.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought directly from the academic sources we've explored today. The treatment of Haitians by the Dominican Republic and the overall relations are embroiled in a complex tangle of historical and social factors unlikely to be resolved in the near future. It really forces us to ask, how do nations move forward when their identities are built on such deeply fractured foundations? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking those tough questions.